since you're at home and drawing is something pretty accessible, you can do it with a pen, a pencil, a burnt piece of wood, which is essentially charcoal. So it's pretty accessible and something that I thought would be good right now to talk about, given that more people have time on their hands. So here I have two kinds of paper. This is a bit thicker. This is just regular printer paper. Readily accessible. I have some pencils here. You'll notice these pencils have numbers and letters written on them. Those indicate the weight of the tip and the graphite that's in there. So for instance, HB gonna give me a fairly mid-tone line. I can of course press harder to make it darker or press lighter to make it lighter. So even if you just have a number 2 pencil, you still have the ability to present areas of light tone versus areas of dark tone, right? You can see the difference. There's also, I mean, I do appreciate sometimes the use of a 2B or a 6B, because you'll see just right off the bat, I have to sharpen these, but it's a bit darker. Like I can go even darker than an HB, my darkest pressure. It's just a fatter line. So, you know, if you can or you want to really expand your pencil drawing process, you can get yourself a set of these pencils. This is from Dick Blick, but there's also, I have some others. So for the first kind of project, I'm just going to ask you to spend 20 minutes or 10 or whatever just with a piece of paper experimenting, right? If you just have one piece of paper, just experiment. Like, how can you create a sense of 3 dimensions with a pencil? And of course, this is a flat thing. So how can you kind of make it feel like this thing actually has dimension? Because of course it doesn't. It's on a flat piece of paper. So a lot of times the way that's done is by creating light and dark areas, right? So I don't know how many, probably maybe some of you had some experience, who knows? So if you know this stuff, then just ignore it and do your own thing. But if you don't, I'm going to go over everything I know. So you can kind of, and again, I'm just going to use the one pencil, but I'm going to pretend like, okay, let's pretend my light source is over here. Here's the sun, right? If the sun's shining down, and this is a 3-dimensional object, I'm going to have some shadows, right? Some shadows are going to be created. And basically, depending where in the sky that sun is and where my form is, that's going to tell me where the lightest part of the drawing should be. So, you know, in effect, if I shade in all over here, and perhaps there's like a harsh shadow here, where's the darkest part? A lot about drawing, if you're trying to draw something that is, if you're trying to draw something that is a representation of how that thing sits in the world, then you have to pay attention to these things. It's really about learning how to look. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to set up a light source and an object. So here you see I have my friend. His nose is a bit smushed, but this is what we're going to use for demonstration purposes. When I turn the light on, right now he's got light on it, but it's a very soft light. And although I'm seeing some tonal differences, I'm going to use a more dramatic light in order to demonstrate what I'm talking about a little more dramatically. So if I turn a light on, now the light source is from the right, but you can see how, especially if I adjust the camera settings, now we have all in here a very dramatic shadow, place where light and dark meet, right? So if I want to make a drawing with very dramatic lighting, I'm going to pay attention to that. And my lines or my marks are going to reflect where that light meets that dark. I'm sorry the background's a bit busy, but we're just going to be focusing on this head. You can set something very similar up in your house. All you really need is a light and some sort of object that's interesting to you, preferably. So I actually have one of these. It's a drawing board, but you can use just like a notebook or anything that's a hard surface. What I'm doing is looking at where those light areas happen and where there's a contrast between light and dark. So, first I can start with pressing very lightly on my pencil. I'm just going to think about the overall shape of this head, right? It's a sphere. Most heads are spheres. And you can think about the angle it's tilted, what direction that would be going. It's not going straight up and down. It's a little bit tilted, right? So those are things to look for. And then, he's got his neck that kind of comes down. But I'm going light right now because I have a feeling I'm going to need to make some adjustments. And if I go dark in the beginning, it's just going to be harder to make those adjustments. So the neck, I'm paying attention to these shapes that I'm seeing and how they interact. Then I'm going to give myself little indications of where the brow bone comes in, the nose comes in. And this guy has a smush nose, so that's going to be reflected in my drawing because I'm doing it from life. And I'm going to just start shading in where I see a lot of shadow, because basically what I'm doing is creating landmarks to remind myself where things are, right? And it's possible, this is a very fluid process at this stage. I'm just going through and identifying where these things are in the landscape of my drawing. Basically you're in some ways creating a map. So if I start shading in just areas, I can start indicating where, because of my dramatic sense of light, I can think about where the curves in the jawbone happen, and when the light, if they're not in direct, if they're not presenting themselves to the light, they're going to be in shadow. So I continue to just develop this. And I'm again just using one pencil because I feel like most of you are probably just going to have one kind of pencil. But sometimes I might come in with a different pencil and go darker. Now, I'm being conscientious right now with how I make these lines. What I think about when I'm doing that is, what does the surface, what direction in my observation of this thing, in what direction do those lines go? Really, they kind of curve around. Because if you feel your neck, And this is perhaps where my sculpting experience affects or influences the way I draw. But when I'm drawing, I'm usually imagining feeling my way around the object. I spend some time doing the lines very regular, and they're all kind of the same. You can also do something like this, which is a much more active mark making, right? In this, I started with this, and now I'm going and thinking, you know, actually, I want to have an indication. I want it to feel like that's going around. So maybe I'm going to add a slight curve to this mark. And these are all options you have that you can play with to, you know, influence your drawing. So again, I'm just finding my way around the map of this face and creating landmarks for myself. And it's nice when you have a model that doesn't move, because when things move, they look different, right? So if you can find something in your house that's interesting, an object in your house that is compelling for you in some way, that helps because it's not going to move that much. If you can find a partner that's reading possibly, or doing an activity that's quiet, maybe you can draw them. So again, you know, I'm slowly, this process isn't, you know, I think sometimes people think art is kind of like magic where, you know, poof, there it is. But I think if you talk to most artists, there's a fair amount of work and labor that goes into things. And some people are very quick, but usually that's a result of experience and practice. Okay, so now that I've got my shadow sort of identified here, I'm just trying to get that a little more accurate. If I start, you know, going over the places I've already done with this pencil, you'll notice it starts to get darker, right? That's obvious. So in places where I'm a little more certain now that that's where I want things, I can go back and try to just make things a little bit darker if I wanted to. And again, this thing has a seam that kind of helps communicate the shape of it. Even though I'm making a flat drawing, this thing that I'm looking around at is round. So there's things I can do with my mark making to elicit that feeling of something being round. Meaning I can add curves to my lines. And now when it comes to identifying the highlights, I am thinking, again, making light marks, because again, I'm just kind of establishing my map. Like I may put something down and then realize, oh, that's a little off. I need to adjust it. So I'm making my marks a little lighter at this point. And I'm not committing, you could say. Not fully committing. Although I will add, personally in drawings, I love seeing those marks where someone just committed. You know, like you can see that in a drawing. But that's a side note. So anyway, now I'm just gently kind of finding my man's smush nose here. And slowly building up where I think his eyes are. And here, okay, so now I'll just say where the light is really intense, you're gonna have, it's gonna look the paper. You're gonna leave the paper color, right? So what you can do, I mean, this is where I'm going to use a line to define that area on the outside, right? You can also, if you don't want to use a line, like let me just finish establishing my map here. This is his mouth. It's got slight shading around his lip, which I'll go back a little. And he has a bit of a pronounced, his chin didn't get smushed. So his chin is still there. But what I've found happening is like my curve, if I'm mimicking the curve I see there, I'm wound up a little bit beyond this jawline that I already established. So that makes me think, okay, did I get a little too long where the mouth is? I think that's what happened. So I have to go back and I kind of readjust where I put his top lip. And now that's given me the space where I can maintain the curve that I see and not and stay within the landscape of this drawing. The parameters I've established, you could say. So I got that back. So now I want to just make one other point is I can go back. I mentioned that when you have a light spot, you can either articulate that by putting a one line, right? Or sometimes you can create a shaded portion on the other side, which will create the sense of light. You know, let's say, actually, he's also got a shadow, which is even darker than this. So that means I'm going to have to add a bit more pressure to this same pencil to get that going a little darker. And this is what we talk about value. A drawing has different values. So now I've got that shadow going. He's also got a dark shadow in here, but this part is kind of in the light. But I'm still trying to give it a sense. I'm trying to articulate the light parts by shading around it. So that's where you have to experiment. Did you go too dark? Did you go too light? Are they all blending in? Are there delineations between the shapes? These are all good questions to think about as you're drawing. And you can see, you can play around. At this point, you know, I've got my basic shape. Now this is where you have to ask yourself, what do you want this drawing to achieve, right? Personally, I enjoy seeing evidence of the hand, where scribbles kind of go outside the lines and not, things aren't perfect, right? But there are also people who like to see real subtle gradations of tone. And I'll show some examples of that. So you have some choices here, and your choice will inform the decisions you make. The intent of your drawing will tell you, you know, how to proceed and what you gravitate towards, what you like. And then you can also decide, hey, right now I love this the way it is. I don't want to keep going. Like there's something nice happening. But I would say you have to be honest, because if you're saying, I just don't feel like doing this anymore, that's not exactly the same thing as this drawing is done. So that's something I'll just encourage you to think about.